Welcome to Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. My name is Mark Reibold. I'm a senior vice president here at Coker, and I'm the host of the podcast. And for today's episode, we have two guests that have been on previously, so we're glad to have them back. Aimee Greeter, who's a senior vice president here at Coker, and Taylor Harrison, who's a senior associate here at Coker, join me in talking about healthcare strategic planning, working now for the future. That's actually a title ties to a white paper that Aimee and Taylor have published, and so you can find a link to that in the show notes for this episode. And our discussion today, we just spent a little bit of time with Aimee and Taylor talking about what is strategic planning for hospitals or medical groups or really any healthcare services organization. Talk about some of the factors to think about and consider, why it's important, what to look for, some of the pieces of the process that often come with the strategic planning engagement. And so we wanted to provide a little bit of a high-level overview. And, of course, you can find a lot more detail that Aimee and Taylor provide in their white paper. They also speak and present on this at conferences all over. So I know it's a hot topic for our audience. It's something that wanted to hear from or hear about, and we're glad we have a chance to address it here. And I know we'll talk more about it here in the future. Hope you enjoy this episode. If you want more information on anything in this episode, or you want to listen to any of our past episodes, you can always find us at coffeewithcoker.com. And we always welcome your feedback. So if you have questions, comments about anything we've talked about in a previous episode or anything you'd like to hear about in future episodes, we'd love to hear that from you, and we'll make sure we address any questions or any topics that are of interest to you all. We thank you for listening. We look forward to this discussion on strategic planning with Aimee and Taylor. We are back again with Aimee Greeter and Taylor Harrison. So welcome back, ladies.
Thank you. We're glad to be back
for another episode. This time we are talking about strategic planning. As we mentioned in the intro, strategic planning is obviously something that Coker does a lot of, and I know the two of you have a lot of experience in this area and are doing more and more. And of course, again, as we mentioned, there will be a white paper coming out on this topic as well. So let's dive into the discussion. And I guess, the first thing I would ask is, obviously, strategic planning is one of those things everybody, I think, acknowledges it's a very important thing to do. It's an important process. But, when you're considering all the changes going on in the healthcare industry over the last few years, the last decade, and even now, and particularly now as we look ahead to 2019, maybe just talk for a minute about these changes and how the industry continues to evolve and where strategic planning comes into play in that.
Sure, absolutely, Mark. It's a very important question, and obviously an important consideration for you that are listening today. So I think something that you said really resonated with me, and that is what has been happening and continues to happen here. And when we think about it, there are a lot of trends that aren't necessarily new, but are becoming increasingly relevant. Things like consumerism. So we've all heard about high deductible health plans and the impact that those have had over the last several years about consumers of healthcare becoming more savvy as purchasers of healthcare. Not a new trend, but again, we're starting to see where there's been increasing transparency based on the demands of those consumers of healthcare for pricing, quality, who's going to be providing the care, etc. I know from personal experience, we've been able to get estimates for my husband's arthroscopic surgery that give us exactly what the price will be at different facilities. And then we can make an informed decision about where we want to access that care. And again, it includes metrics like price and about outcomes. Well, that's very interesting as a consumer of healthcare. Obviously, not everybody can choose the highest cost, highest quality option. And so there are some trade-offs that consumers have to make when they're doing some planning. So with respect to overall health systems, you have to think about if you can't be the lowest cost provider, which, for example, example, hospitals can't be if they're competing with ASCs or in-physician office experiences, then how do they differentiate themselves to really draw consumers in? If it's not cost, can they really differentiate themselves on quality or on other patient experience considerations, et cetera? So I think that's something we're seeing a lot of is how is consumerism continuing to play out right now?
I know one of the things when, and the work that I do, which is usually working on some sort of transaction, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a medical group, it seems like now any discussion, any scenario where there's kind of a consolidation play, a transaction, a merger, acquisition, whatever that may be, I see very few of those these days that don't have some strategic planning process around it. Is that topic becoming more and more important in the whole consolidation discussion?
Absolutely. And I think I have a bit of a personal bias since I cut my teeth in healthcare on consolidation, alignment, mergers and acquisitions. So I obviously think about that often. But you're right, Mark. There's a lot of consideration right now into overall consolidation and alignment. So hospital systems are looking at the pressures that face them. And as a result, looking at should they be acquired? Should they do acquiring? Should they grow their network? Are there other steps that they can take to either fight off or embrace consolidation? It's a huge consideration in addition to just the strategy behind who do you look to align with, again, either on the acquisition side or the purchasing side. There's also this consideration of what are the economics of that? What infrastructure do we need to have in place to support that? That trickles down throughout your entire strategic plan. So a lot of considerations come into that overall concept of consolidation. I'd also say that in terms of consolidation, a new interest is physician practice that are aggregating. And so we had seen a significant amount of health systems acquiring physician practices, and yet we're starting to see a number of practices increase in terms of looking at it as going out there on their own, increasing in size, increasing in the number of specialties that they serve within their private practice, but having a stronger foothold in the community as completely private practice entities. And if that's happening in your market and in your health system, you need to think about, well, then again, how do we differentiate ourselves? What do our physician services look like if, in essence, our physician base is largely private, largely outside of our governance, our control, and may have different goals than we do? How do we bring those interests together when those physician practices may or may not need us? They have alternative options for providing care, and they might not need all those inpatient services like they previously had. How do we deal with that? And again, that is a huge consideration in the strategic plan. What's happening with your physician base?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, there's so many different variables there that I think it's hard to make a major decision organizationally without undergoing some of that strategic planning process. And then, I think that the whole value-based healthcare trend as we look forward to 2019 and beyond, as value-based care becomes more and more prominent, I find it hard for any hospital or medical group to be able to argue that they don't need a strategic plan when it comes to this volume to value shift. Maybe speak to that if you can.
Sure, absolutely. And that's relevant too, Mark. Great point. It's funny, we so often 5, 6, 7 years ago heard clients say, oh, this value-based, environment is just something that's passing, just like all these other ones are, and we're just going to ride out this wave. And now, in a year ago, 6 months ago, more people are saying, I've seen other hospitals responding to value-based environments by doing this. How can I replicate that, or how can I improve upon that, or how can I take advantage of what they're doing, in our system as well? So with that difference of line of question, you can almost see the sense of buy-in from people, right? It's not that this is the denial stage anymore. It's the acceptance and moving on stage. So for people that are struggling with that transition from volume to value, I think that's normal. I think that people are always looking at how do we do this successfully when we might not have a lot of expertise in doing this ourselves. We might not have people on staff that have expertise in this area. So how do we continue to fight the demands of governmental regulations? How do we respond to changing incentives from payers? How do we adapt to what we see as stagnant at best commercial payer contracts? As all these things impact our system, how do we respond to them? And so many of those things, the regulations, the payer contracts, the changing incentives, are all very much becoming more closely tied to value-based care. And so what do we need to do, to think about that, to respond to that? So there is not, and I tell you this truthfully, there is not a strategic plan that I have worked on in the last year in which this was not a major consideration, just like consumerism and just like consolidation. Absolutely seismic shifts going on in the industry that people need to look forward and be thinking about how they're going to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's safe to say we are the industry, the healthcare industry in the country is in a certain state of flux. One could possibly argue that it's in a continuous state of flux. But regardless, whether it's a hospital, again, or a medical group, they have to take the time to evaluate initiatives and ensure they have a plan in place that addresses the changes that are coming or could potentially come. So at least they're prepared to, they're dynamic enough to adjust for such changes. All right. So with that in mind and that context, let's talk about strategic planning. Specifically, what are the goals of strategic planning?
Mm-hmm. I don't know how many people on the line are interested in hockey as a sport, but I grew up in the Midwest and it's huge there. And one of the old adages goes, don't skate to where the puck is, skate to where the puck is going to be. And that's what strategic planning is about. It's about picking your head up and thinking about, where do I need to be into the future? Not where am I today or where do I have to be tomorrow, but really what should I be doing to set myself up for success going forward, massively forward, not just tomorrow or next week. And so strategic planning really gives us an opportunity to think about, what do I need to be doing? Well, and the way that you do that is you think about your current performance. What's going well now? Where are we exhibiting best practices? Where are we consistent with best practices? Where have we faltered a little bit? You can think about the traditional SWOT analysis. What are our strengths? What are weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? And then think about, what are the issues that we haven't even come up against, but we know are out there. We don't necessarily know to what extent they're going to impact us or come into our market, but we know that they're out there and we need to contend with that. And then I think strategic planning gives an absolutely ideal opportunity to revisit your organization's mission, vision, and values. And this is not to spend half of your strategic planning process trying to wordsmith already good mission, vision, values, but rather, are they directionally appropriate for where your organization needs to be? And again, that forward-thinking focus, not does it reflect what we're doing today, but is our mission, vision, and values going to be that beacon that we need out into the future? And if we can continue to focus on those and working towards those, we know that we're directionally appropriate. I think one of the other goals of strategic planning is to make sure that we have identified strategies to realize that vision for the future. So it can't be this 100,000-foot level. There has to be actual strategies that can be drilled down into actionable outcomes set with timelines and people responsible, etc. But that's another thing, is that your goal is to have something that's actionable. And it may not be completely detailed. I'm not telling you to get to the 10-foot level, but you certainly need to be further drilled in than the 100,000-foot level. And then I think another goal of strategic planning is that you use it as an opportunity to communicate the goals of the organization. So usually the release of a strategic plan is something that's relatively public. If it's kept on your CEO's shelf in a binder and never sees the light of day, that's problematic. Your strategic plan is something that allows you to communicate where the organization is going. It creates a consistent vision for the future, and it gives an opportunity for buy-in from every level of your organization. Overarchingly, your strategic plan should be a tool that allows you to make decisions, that allows you to rally the troops, that allows you to be better in the future than you were today. And whether that's based on your financial performance or your patient satisfaction, your strategic plan should really set you up to be something better than you are today.
Yeah. I'm not even a hockey fan, but I appreciate the sports analogy for me. So at least thank you. Well, all right, so that's helpful. I think one of the things about strategic plans, quote, air quotes here, they can seem very nebulous, or it's somewhat the eye of the beholder, meaning people throw the term around a lot, but what a strategic plan means to me may be different from what a strategic plan should look like to you. So let's get a little more specific, and Taylor, maybe you can jump in and just walk us through what are some of the metrics and kind of the assessments and processes that are typical for a strategic plan so that you can accomplish some of these goals that Aimee just talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the strategic planning process, one of the really important parts of it is that initial assessment. So it's looking at where you stand today, again, like Aimee spoke about, where there are issues, where there are opportunities, where there's threats, et cetera. And one of the benefits of bringing in a third party is to kind of look at all this data that you probably look at often on a daily basis, maybe in a different light. So a lot of these are assessments that you're running internally that may get presented in different meetings here or there, but really looking at it from a holistic view. So this needs to be both qualitative and quantitative, and we really need to look at it and deep dive on this data and see what it's telling us and where that's leading us in this strategic plan. Because when we come up with our ending recommendation, we want to make sure that it's not only operationally supported, but also financially supported. And that, as nebulous as some of these changes in the industry may be, at least the data is telling us this is what we need to do based on the changes at this time. Mm-hmm. So we really kind of look at three different areas. And again, this is going to change based on your organization. It's going to change based on the size. It's going to change based on the scope of the organization and the scope of the strategic plan itself. But these are kind of the general areas that we would start to look at. The first one's going to be your macro environment factors. So these are things like, what is government regulations at the time? What are, the macro MIPS changes, things like that are driving you to look at different strategic planning ideas. What are your financial ramifications in your market? Not just your immediate market, but what's happening at the state level? What's happening at the national level? Are there changes that are making you have to respond in a way that's a little bit maybe less risky? So this could be something like, is your Medicare, Medicaid well funded in your state? Things like that. The next is your population. So we have talked about this for a very long time. You've heard it said, we have an aging population. You are going to see it in every single market. And a lot of times you even see a declining population leading up to that age bracket. So you have to be able to formulate a strategy to respond to that. That's in all aspects of all healthcare organizations. And the last is utilization. And similar to kind of the consumerism that Aimee was talking about earlier, again, what we're seeing is that inpatient use rates are declining somewhat. Again, this is somewhat changing based on the aging population, which tends to use these services more. But overarchingly, we're seeing a decline in that. So you have to be cautious of are you preparing for the actual likelihood of utilization in your inpatient facilities? The second factor is these market factors. So this is more specific to your individual service area, both your primary and secondary service areas. So this, we're going to start looking at competition. What is your competition doing in the area? What are their service lines they're pursuing? What are the service lines you're pursuing heavily? How do these match? What are the payer mix patterns in your market? What's happening there? What are the patient patterns? So again, are people moving out of your primary service area to go to your competitors? Are people moving in from your secondary service areas to go to your hospitals? If they are, for what service lines? What are you really drawing there? The last is your partnerships. So these are going to be both clinically. So again, Aimee was talking about these massive practices that are happening. So a lot of this can be looking at, okay, well, how are we partnered with these people? Is this a sustainable partnership? Is this something that is going to be harmful for us as we look into some of these strategic planning concepts such as value-based care. I mean, do we have the strategic physician partners to accomplish these things? The other partnerships we'd look at are more operational. So these are your payer partners, your even your purchasing partners, your consultants, everything that you're using kind of more on an operational level. And then the final is your internal factors. So again, this is going to look at your financial, that's your typical analysis of where's your revenue, where your expenses, are your expenses outpacing your revenue, all of those items, cultural. So these are looking at how is your physician and employee base, how is their satisfaction, what is the dynamic there, what is the focus on quality and patient safety, and are all of those in the right place? Then your portfolio of how you are staffed. Do you have a strong primary care physician base to support some of these initiatives? Do you have specialty providers that can pull in some of that additional revenue? What does that look like? And then finally, again, looking at quality and outcomes. What are we actually performing, and how is that driving some of these other things that we need to do?
Yeah. I was just thinking as you're going through these, it's interesting because many of these things seem relatively obvious, meaning they're things that organizations should do, and they probably are doing some of them, maybe all of them, to a certain degree. I think what's interesting about strategic planning process is that, this is an exercise to bring a lot of this together, as opposed to maybe it is a different way of looking at some of that same data or some of those same metrics that you've maybe seen in the past, but in a different context. So as far as continuing with the theme of trying to, understand what this process looks like and, what are strategies for healthcare organizations, can y'all walk us through some of, general examples that may apply or that may develop through a process like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, these are illustrative. They are totally nuanced based on the organization size and what's going on in your individual market. But a lot of these come up as we talk about them. And even if they are brought up so that we can say, that's not our strategy at this moment, we're not going to pursue XYZ, we still likely discuss them. Mm-hmm. So a few of these examples are, growth of physical presence. So again, this can be the actual facility. Do we need more inpatient beds? Do we need more psychiatric units? Things like that, as well as what's our ambulatory presence, or what actually do we have, different hospitals within our health system? Do we want to grow our service area? Things like that. The next is expansion of provider resources. So again, this is looking at how many of these providers do we actually employ? Do we need to look to grow our employed provider base or our aligned provider base? Or are we comfortable partnering with these providers externally? Again, that's another one. We'd look at strengthening our partner bases. So if we are partnering with practices, if we're partnering with other clinical opportunities in the market, then how is that structured and is that sustainable? Again, like I said earlier, that also includes your more operational partners. Another one would be improvement of employee satisfaction and retention. So what did our data tell us, and do we need to improve that? That's a huge, huge cost for organizations and something that we have to look at, especially in more rural markets. Again, we look at optimization of our clinical portfolio. So do we have all the specialties we need to support a full care continuum? If not, how do we partner with other people to complete that? And how do we make sure that we are driving value into all of this? Again, that's, like I just said, the optimization of the continuum of care. So again, that can include not only the physicians, but the actual facilities in which they're provided. So ASCs, et cetera. Finally, reduction of and control of costs. So this includes your optimization of your payer contracts. This includes all the costs within the facilities and the cost of the providers themselves. We just need to make sure that all of that is controlled and optimized in the best way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there, obviously. And I know you go into more detail on some of these examples and descriptions about them in the white paper. But I can imagine, what all is entailed in a process like this. But I guess help us and help the audience understand a little bit more about the process itself. Can you kind of either walk us through or kind of help us get a feel for what that process looks and feels like?
Absolutely. So Taylor mentioned when she was talking about the metrics and assessments that are completed as part of the strategic plan, that it really depends upon the organization and what level of investment you're willing to make, what your resource capability is, etc. So I'll offer these processes for consideration here, but with an asterisk that you really need to think about what the needs of your organization are. However, broadly, I will say that there are two common steps to the overall strategic planning process. The first is some sort of strategic planning retreat or other internal analyses. And that, while it sounds retreat to be somewhat formal, it really is meant to bring in your stakeholders and get their feedback. And that means a cross-section of people from across your organization. It should include your board. It should include your physicians. It should include your administrative team. But it should also include those people who are on the front lines of the operations every day, because ultimately we all can appreciate the fact that this strategy is going to roll across the organization. And so you want people to be providing input that are on those front lines.
And let's face it, those are the people that probably know the details best anyway. So you want that accurate input.
Absolutely. That's exactly right, Mark. And candidly, the people that are at the bedside are the ones that have the primary interactions with the patients. They're the ones that are going to make or break the experience in so many ways for our patients. So we need them to be invested in this process. And one of the ways that we effectively do that, to your point, is ask them. Find out what's going on in their day-to-day life. Ask them what's working, what's not working. And then we need to be able to extrapolate that very detailed information to the overall strategies that Taylor talked about before, but you can't develop a strategy without having a really good basis of information. So whether or not you have a formal retreat or you have multiple town hall sessions or you meet with individual stakeholders, your first step in this process is to get as much information as possible. In addition to the interviews, you're also going to want to get as much data as information as possible. So you're going to want to make sure that you're working with your departments that have and hold the information about your performance. Again, clinically, operationally, financially. Make sure that you're getting good, accurate data. The second part of this process is after you have all of this information in place, taking it and doing some analyses, developing that strategic plan with those higher level strategies that I referred to, where you're taking all this information down to the very, very highly detailed level and you're bringing it up. I mentioned before that strategic planning gives you that opportunity to lift your head up, and that's exactly what you do in the second half of this process is you look, bring your head up and say, how do all of these things relate to, again, where do we want to be? Where is that puck going to be? And so the other component of that process will have to be the external analyses. And Taylor talked about the market factors and the macro environment factors as being very influential in this process. And so you have to consider those as you're developing your plan. Not only have you thought about what your internal stakeholders are doing, you need to think about what's happening in your environment as well. So what I would say is the difference between that first internal stakeholder information gathering and that second strategic plan development, considering your external factors, is really the level of detail of analysis that's happening. Your internal factor can have more of a qualitative feel in some ways. It'll certainly have a quantitative component, but your external will be the same. It'll have a lot of those quantitative considerations. Who performs such is also a consideration. Obviously, if you're investing in your internal resources, soliciting their feedback, you're going to want someone that's relatively familiar with the organization. Looking at the external, it's good to have somebody who has some external experience, somebody that can help you look more broadly at your market, at the healthcare industry in total, etc. So overall, I would say that the strategic planning process, those two components should be done annually. There are a lot of people who think that you can stretch it out every 2 or 3 years, and you may be able to, but I think unless you're doing some sort of a check-in annually, you're going to find yourself too far down the road to be able to react quickly or accurately to the market as it's changing. One of the things that I think we all appreciate about healthcare is the fact that it is rapidly changing. And so if you wait too long, you're going to find yourself left out in the cold as opposed to being really on the front lines of where you want to be. The other thing I would say with respect to the process is that the end of that strategic plan, that written tome that we hope doesn't sit on the CEO's shelf, has to be communicated. All that has to be communicated to people. And so when you're thinking about the overall timeline, you need to be communicating what the strategic plan is and what is expected of people in 7 different ways, in 7 different settings, in 7 different, from 7 different voices. And so all that communication takes a while. So as you think about the process, don't shortchange yourself on that end component, which is that key communication aspect. And so make sure that when you are thinking about your process, it's not just internal but external, but also that you have this plan and disseminate it to all the appropriate parties.
Yeah, and I have to think, too, another point that may not be obvious or maybe easily overlooked sometimes, that it's not a one-stop experience or process. It's not a one-time thing. It is something that is almost a continuous process, or should be. And so it's not that you just do the strategic plan, hey, that's it, until maybe 5 years or something like that. It's something that's revisited each year, maybe even more frequently, and updated too. I think it has to be there has to be a dynamic flavor to it as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think if your entire organization doesn't understand what your goals are, there's no way that people can be marching in the same direction if they don't understand what the goals are.
Sure.
And so keeping that front of mind, like you said, Mark, is incredibly important. It keeps us all directionally aligned. It keeps us all moving and motivated, hopefully, towards a common goal. So it's important that stays out front of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been extremely helpful. I know our audience is interested in this topic, and so I know we'll get a lot of value from the white paper as well for kind of more details and more explanation behind some of these things. But I think we'll be circling back on this subject in the future as well on a future episode. So thanks for participating, and we look forward to talking more about it here in the near future.
Thanks, Mark. We're happy to be here, and we'll come back anytime.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.